Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Dan Correa. I'm the CEO of the Federation of American Scientists, and I'm here with an all-star panel to talk about supercharging partnerships and driving commitments to action. So we're going to kick off by introducing ourselves. Over to you, Kathleen.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'm Kathleen Warner, and I'm a senior advisor with the America Achieves team, which is part of the larger TA team, working with y'all. Super excited to be spending some time today with my colleagues and putting my own operational experience in crafting and leading large-scale economic development and entrepreneurial ecosystems with a focus on partnerships. So again, excited to be here. Ishan?
Hi, yeah, my name is Ishan. I'm a fellow at the Federation of American Scientists, where I work with Dan, and we've been helping put together some guidance on commitments. You may have received an email earlier today from Scott, sort of getting into part of what we'll talk about today, but we hope to add more color to this memo. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you so much. My name is Jen Steinfeld. I'm the Director of Entrepreneurship and Economic Development at the National League of Cities Institute. We're so pleased to be part of the technical assistance team here, and it's very aligned to our values and looking at inclusive and equitable economic growth and focusing on your local assets to build towards the future. And I will be back at the end. These three fine people are going to share their wisdom with you. I'll be back at the end to help moderate the Q&A. So don't worry if you don't see me.
Thanks so much, Jen. So I think we're good to move to the agenda. So here is the quick outline for how we'll spend our time together in this session. If you had a chance to look at the memo, you might recognize some key themes, but I'm sure you will probably have questions. And so, as Jen mentioned, we'll leave about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. And if you don't mind transitioning to the key point of the whole presentation in the slide deck. So wanted to just stress this up front, and Dan will kind of elaborate more on this in the next slide, but there's a really amazing opportunity between now and March 15th to leverage your phase 2 applications. And so we hope that this presentation arms you with the tools necessary to go back to your coalition partners and secure what we call commitments for long-lasting economic development.
Terrific. Thanks, Ishan, and thanks for setting us up here. So as Ishan said, many of your phase 1 applications included what we're calling commitments in some form. And in many cases, these are letters of support that you appended to your application that include some tangible commitment of support. The point that I think we wanted to start with here that's really important is that this window of assembling a phase 2 application is a critical opportunity, and one in which you as applicants have a tremendous amount of leverage in helping a much broader coalition of supporters and potential partners to level up their commitments. So in this first phase, many of you assembled commitments from research universities, academic medical centers, ports, bases, national labs, et cetera, political actors and philanthropic actors. These partners have stepped forward and endorsed the work that you're doing, and obviously want to share not only in the success of the work that you've proposed, but also to share in some of the credit. And so now we've seen this work really well. Now is a critical window to go back and help to elaborate and make more specific those commitments and build new ones. So I just want to underscore real quick, I think there's 3 points that are just really foundational at the beginning as you think about this during the phase 2 window. So number 1, I think we've all seen our colleagues at EDA are thinking about this process through a very sophisticated lens. So, it's like an investor like looking at an application and reviewing it, none of the things that you proposed in your phase one applications are things you can do alone. It's going to take an entire constellation of actors in order to truly achieve these visions. And so the commitments process that we're talking about is a critical opportunity to round out some of the strengths that you yourselves are bringing by supplementing them with commitments from others in areas where you can shore up your proposals. So that's number one. I think number two, we want to encourage and empower you. So this process is giving you both a license to hunt and some tools that we've seen work in a whole variety of contexts at the state and local level in government, in nonprofits, and at the federal government and the White House. Time and again, I think the process that we're describing is something that can be incredibly high leverage at a moment like this, both in helping your commitment makers to be both more ambitious as well as more specific and commit to timelines and actual projects. And then finally, Ishan mentioned the written guidance. We have some examples from key sectors. We're interested in helping. So this is all a start. We'd love to find ways to follow up with you directly if you have specific questions. None of these things get specific, actionable, and real without iteration and coaching, and we're happy to help play that role. Okay, over to you, Kathleen.
Thanks, Dan. This is also a real, if we go, it's a real scoring opportunity. Your partner commitments, as Dan mentioned and Ginny alluded to in her presentation as well, they are really the key enablers of your region's economic competitiveness. We'll talk about specifically how they relate to 3 specific phase 2 evaluation criteria, but really these commitments also relate indirectly to all the other criteria across the board. And I can't stress enough that the commitments are an overall means of the EDA to ensure, verify, if you will, that your partners are coming forward to provide concrete, specific support in driving that long-lasting, transformative economic impact that we're all working towards. I also want to point out that, certainly from my work and work that we've done across the coalition, that building these concrete partnerships signals to other investors, other partners, to come in about the viability and sustainability of a proposal. So again, these commitments relate to phase 2 evaluation, but provide the EDA with some just real specificity on the go forward. Ishan?
Yeah, and just quickly to add, underscoring that meaningful commitments are really what drive the sustainability of coalitions and collaborations. So this is a chance to think critically about the strengths of each of your coalition partners and prove to EDA that you're having your partners play to their strengths, or having them commit to action in that circumstance. And so the memo sort of gets into this, but different institutions, different key actors have different strengths, right? Employers can marshal financial resources and technical assistance to address key market gaps and make hiring commitments that advance equity and economic development. That's different than the role that universities can play in clearing a path for translating research and development into regional economic outcomes. And so I think the key point here is, as you listen throughout the presentation and look at these key institutional actors in the list, is to think about the application to your, the application to your own coalition and how we can build and get those partners to commit to more action.
And so I think that the key point that I would pull out here is this process is a manifestation of what we've heard from our colleagues at EDA, that this challenge is not business as usual, right? And so there is certainly utility in a lot of the letters that you have generated in the first phase. But what we're here to talk about is opportunities to run up the score and think about both making those more concrete or finding new sources and new commitments from new actors that reach beyond a standard form letters. And so I think this is really an important part of the process. It is, and I think the most competitive applicants will have relevant commitments that play to the strengths of the institutions making the commitments with firm timelines and firm details that show that these are both meaningful contributions and novel contributions that otherwise wouldn't have happened. Great.
So if we go to the next slide, with respect to phase 2 evaluation criteria, these are the most relevant and the direct criteria to which partnership commitments apply. So, but we'll also get into a bit later how commitments touch upon the other evaluation criteria, including, for example, hiring, workforce development, and community engagement through that equity first lens. So if we go to the next slide on the next point on competitive commitments, Dan.
Great. Are we there?
Actually, if we could just run the deck real quick to show the phase 2. Thank you so much. And I think there might be one more key point as well.
So again, talking about, oh, sorry, my screen's a little bit. So if we're talking about, the regional competitiveness, that's the first of the direct commitments with respect to the criteria. Dan?
Got it. I'm jumping in here. Okay.
I know.
Perfect. Okay. So, so as you can see on the slide, we think that these are these fundamental criteria: relevant and specific, public, and high impact. These are the gold standards. So we mentioned language that's specific to an institution's strengths, public because there's an actual public articulation that is a commitment, an organization that's tying itself to the mast, that they are part of this project, and then what they're signing up to do, they will be evaluated in the public domain. And then finally, I mean, the most important piece is the nexus with your application, and that this is high impact. And so if we go, I think we're going to the next slide. If we go to the next slide, I think the question here is, what does all of this amount to? We know that many of the support documents from phase 1 so many of the supporting organizations from phase 1 will want to offer similar commitments in phase 2, and some will be similar. That's totally fine. But the point I think that we want to underscore is that these elements that we just described will help you and help commitment makers elevate your application above and beyond. So quality over quantity. And the memo that we shared gets into the details of describing what that is. Okay. So this means that I think we're going to turn to Ishan to take us through a little more detail and some examples.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So as the slide gets at, there's sort of 4 key institutional actors based on the memo that we'd sent, but the way we've also just from reading the several applications and finding, these are the actors that could make a lot of difference in terms of long-lasting economic development. That is not to say that these are the only actors, so we would encourage you to be creative in thinking about the types of commitments or the ways in which you can leverage your coalition partners. But in the remainder of the session, before the Q&A, we'll get into a few key examples, and we would invite you to join us in brainstorming, how we can go from version 1.0 of commitments, which we'll show you, into version 2.0, which get at the ideas of relevant and specific commitments, public commitments, new and high impact, as well as Dan was just mentioning. So if we can transition to the next slide, that'd be awesome.
So if we start with university commitments, we might think this is a great commitment. They've committed to a new position. But if we lean in a bit and provide some additional details, how could we make this commitment more concrete? and thus more actionable and more powerful for the long-term economic growth of the region. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts to weigh in.
So if we advance the slides, we can see what it looks like after what we would consider our commitments treatment. So this is a revised version. You can see in red that some of the additions that make this more specific and relevant. So version 1.0 was let's create a role. Version 2.0 says a little more about why we'd be doing this and what the roles, what this individual would be empowered to do. Kathleen, any more thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, there's also, a clear measurable goal here, a commercialization and an output by 2 times by 2024. So again, more specificity, actually something that we can look at and measure over time.
Right. And I think we also wanted to highlight Not Suited and with EDA funding to touch on what you've heard in the past few weeks from Scott and the EDA team. What is the but-for impact here? Why is this commitment really going to be transformational, right? This commitment sort of gets into the theory of change that they're hoping for. They've noticed this particular barrier in the form of bureaucratic hurdles and offered a key solution. So that's why we would put this in the category of, new, but also high impact, getting at, sharing more information on the state of the play in the ecosystem and how this commitment could unlock a lot more benefits going forward. I think we're good to transition to the next slide. Thanks so much. So, this is the first version of the commitment. I'll give you all a few moments to think about, how you might make this more actionable, recognizing that it's a bit hard for you to directly participate. And then I think we can show the refined example in about 5 to 10 seconds. Or now that works too. Dan, over to you.
Yeah. So just to make sure, in case just to make sure everybody can see it and read it. So the initial version was industry partners committing to hiring individuals that are trained through a workforce development program. This is good as far as it goes, but the revised version after the commitments treatment gets much more specific numbers, timelines, and even underscores an equity component relevant to who we are hiring. It also describes in detail why the organization's making this commitment, reinforcing confidence in the workforce development initiatives as being relevant to their own hiring pipelines. Kathleen, what else did you see here?
Yeah, in here, it also acknowledges a risk to the workforce plan, that there's been a challenge in with respect to historically excluded communities and uptake within that community, and offers some direct incentives to join that program. I also want to reinforce what Don mentioned in our equity session earlier, that behind this commitment is the working within and engaging with the historically excluded community to figure out what actually works that comes out in this commitment itself. So it's a commitment that, yes, is an industry commitment, but it goes to also what happens behind the scenes and working through what is something that is actionable and concrete to drive larger equitable change. So I think we're also now going to be looking at political commitments, because there's incredible power working with your political leaders, and at the gubernatorial level across the state. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that might look like. So here we have something that looks at first blush as a good commitment, but we want to talk about what might make this more actionable and therefore more powerful.
Yeah.
So here, are we gonna, if we can move forward to the next slide? So
Go ahead.
here, the governor, great, thanks so much. Here, the governor is the key actor with the authority to bring high impact resources to bear in the form of $100 million. Ishan, some thoughts?
Right. So, I mean, so on first impact, that's a lot of money flowing into the ecosystem, right? That produces a lot of follow-on funding, that sustainability, that's, driving the long-lasting change that we want to see happen, but from political leadership. And so I think, relatedly, that's also why like the state small business credit initiative and the state economic development agencies are highlighted here. It's something that only political leadership institutions can foster, getting at the idea that when you were crafting commitments, when you were thinking about your coalition, you want those commitments to play to the strengths of the institution. In this case, these are the only actors capable of making such investments and also having sort of the regulatory structures, the federal funding coordination that is so key with achieving long-lasting development. Dan, anything from you?
Well, I guess I would just pull out also that I think the word equitable is highlighted here. I think this is another way to underscore tangible commitments to equity. And that on a more general note, applicants have a license to hunt for not just commitments in these domains, but also with state and federal actors as well, in order to generate high impact complementary funding where this can be the but-for cause. So I think these exercises, what we're hoping to do with you all, and we can go to the philanthropy slide next because we want to give you another example. But before I turn to Ishan, I just think it's worth underscoring, these are all very specific versions of commitments. Yours will look different. But we wanted to take you through the thinking of how to approach the conversation with commitment makers, because in many cases, when we say that we're empowering you and we're giving you license to do this, you're going to have to be the ones driving, using your leverage and asking them to get more specific. Can you make it more tangible so that in this application, those who are reviewing it feel like these are credible, real, and relevant to the vision that we're articulating? And so this is sort of the goal, is to think through that process. Okay, Ishan, over to you on philanthropic commitments.
Yeah, so totally agree, Dan. So in this, I think this is a great example of that. So in this commitment, version 1.0 is this idea that the undersigned philanthropies will commit to aligning their strategic investment priorities with the application's outlined project outcomes. So that's really exciting, right? There's a few key things here. Strategic investment priorities is a term that relates to how philanthropies think about making their investments going forward. But I imagine, given the previous 3 slides, you all might be thinking about ways, to improve this. Are there ways to make this more measurable? Is there a timeline that we could explore here? And so, I'm sure the answers will just reveal itself in a sec, but just trying to get you all in the process of thinking about, how we can take the commitments that so many of you have in your form letters and making them into something that, are much more competitive. So if we might click the next, that'd be great. Awesome. So, in this context, I think we've seen publicly, which is a little bit different. And so, curious if anyone has thoughts on why might publicly be highlighted. To me, and feel free for others to jump in, but to me, it's helpful. It's helpful for establishing more accountability in how, philanthropies are committing vis-a-vis their own brand publicly, et cetera. But it also sort of generates follow-on momentum. If one philanthropy is coming out saying, expressing support, others might also join in support, or investors might be willing to support as the investments from philanthropies de-risk the types of operations outlined in the project application. And so I think relatedly, getting to the timeline point, there's a 5-year strategic investment call out here, and it adds $25 million to that as well. So it touches on, both what is possible from philanthropies, but also what is specific in committing to their strategic investment priorities.
Yeah, and this commitment again is a suggestion, an example which leans into philanthropy's competencies, capacity, and that greater awareness, and projecting that concrete use of funds. Other examples around could be used for feasibility studies, market demand analyses, and this is a starting point, if you will, not an ending point, of how to build into more concrete recommendations. And key here to Ishan's point about public, it's really committing about communicating more information to the larger ecosystem about that commitment of a key player, individuals, foundations, community foundations, corporate foundations for that matter, about what really matters, how they're engaging, and where they are in a particular point in time.
Here's what I like about this commitment. So I think it's sort of table stakes to go and recruit a local or regional foundation to sign on in some capacity with a form letter. I think what this commitment does is brings together a coalition of philanthropies that are committing themselves to being at the table and helping to support the success of this over the long term. So it represents coordination, it represents long-term thinking, and it represents sustainability as the next 5 years. Who knows, right? Some of the eventualities that will ensue, but this is a thoughtful approach to ensuring that resources and thinking and coordination are available in order to ensure success. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's it for examples. Let me throw it back to Ishan. I think he's going to close us out.
Yeah. Well, really quickly, I wanted to underscore this just on this particular commitment, what Kathleen and Dan had said, which is broadly that, you all may be concerned with, this is a lot, right? Like, how do I stick this in my application when I'm concerned about brevity, right? Part of what this particular commitment is doing is sharing more information on the ecosystem that you are operating in, right? So in phase one, a lot of the TA sessions, a lot of like our context is, what is the actual market case here, as Bruce mentioned earlier on, right? So thinking about leveraging this, which both gets at, what is your governance and like between your coalition partners, but then also, demonstrates the awareness of the philanthropies. A rapid response contracting fund is, identifying a key gap. It doesn't necessarily mean that is the thing that this money will be spent on, but it shows that, the philanthropies as well as other institutions are thinking in advance about what are potential risks that could happen and how to solve those. That's just another way to, I think, strengthen both the information, but also the longevity of your application. I think we're good to switch to the next slide. So I know we threw a lot at you today and sort of flew through several of the examples. I think most of this will be summarized in the memo. And so I would encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to take a look, both in our session, in the 15 minutes we'll give you back during this session, but also at the end of the day session, which is optional. I think while you're reading through this memo, I would encourage you to think about also, two key questions. Which existing partnerships do you want to prioritize to gain greater specificity, and why? Are there parts of your application that aren't ringing through, or are there gaps that you haven't really identified that it would make sense to have a coalition letter of support or industry partners letters of support sort of explain why what they're committing to is actually going to be really transformational given the application materials that you've put together? Secondly, are there prospective partners that you could start cultivating now to bolster the partnerships you already have in place? Thinking about additional actors or other ones that you can pull in. Have you engaged your state economic development agency? Are there philanthropies that are like within your region that could be engaged? Are there national laboratories that, there's a range of actors here that could be introduced to bring support. And I think to the earlier points, phase one was a great example of you bringing them to the table Now, phase 2 is an opportunity to get them to commit to action, which is what we hope the memo in this session will give you. And then lastly is the intake process. So we appreciate that there's a lot of diversity in the applications. Many of you have amazing commitments, many of you have commitments, and some of you don't, and that's okay. We want to know and hear from you based on where you are at in this process. And so in the memo that was sent over earlier by Scott, it contains a link, promise a 5-minute survey at the most. It's very brief, to fill out and identify areas that, which actors would you like help in securing commitments from? And also, what types of commitments? Is it lab to market commercialization commitments? Is it a governance commitment? Is there, so in that intake form, you'll be able to let us know how we should structure follow-on guidance for this commitment process. And I think we can pass it over to Jen for Q&A with about 15 minutes.
Great. Well, we have a lot of questions already from folks, but I'd like to start this just by summarizing some of the key points that I heard. So one thing I heard was that the constellation and ecosystem approach is really important, and you have to have those strong, specific commitments from your partners. That clear, specific commitments help make your project investable, not just by EDA, but some of these other funders and investors. And I have a follow-on comment / question to that, which is just to think about having those commitments be permanent and not just contingent upon the EDA funding, but to help create that momentum beyond and outside of EDA funding. That your commitments, you really want them to build on the specific strengths and assets from each partner, and you want them to align to your region's competitive edge and to your project's specific goals. That they're an opportunity to flesh out the story of your region's project and your ecosystem beyond the limitations of the application itself. And that linking these strong public commitments to your anticipated program outcomes, to SMART goals, including equity and a linkage to their own mission and priorities helps to make that commitment really strong and follow throughable. Are there any points that you want to make sure that we underscore just again before we go into questions?
Yeah, I would just say be bold, be bold. Don't, and we didn't really say that. I'm just emphasizing that in the end, because you're in an incredible position right now as finalists. And I think what Dan's point is made earlier, which EDA has stressed, you are among 60 winners in an incredibly crowded field. And so utilize that and be bold and creative. And what we gave you some examples, and we thought we were being creative, but I expect there's a lot of incredible brain power on this call today. I know there is. So be fearless and bold in your asks. Go big.
Kathleen, I love it. And Jen, I think that was an excellent summary of the most important points. So I wouldn't add anything.
All right. Well, thank you. That's why they bring me in for the wrap up at the end, right? So we've had a bunch of questions from folks, and some of them are really specific, including one, you gave the political example. This is quite closely tied to that. Our governor's proposed FY23 budget includes funds supporting our cluster's efforts. However, those funds are subject to legislative approval, and that approval likely won't be finalized before the application goes in. How can we make the most of this expression of support from our governor, even though that investment is not certain? And I imagine there are other folks, again, because this is a longer period of time, that might be in similar positions where the will is there, but that commitment might not be super solid right at this moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I also want to say we understand the realities that we're, that folks address, and sometimes the competing, the challenges of political actors, industry actors, and academic actors, right? You go out there and perhaps the governor can commit to, engaging and championing this legislation, right? He or she is making that political commitment and is stating that political commitment. And in addition, recognizing there's a legislative aspect to that, committing to being that champion as one of, his or her legislative priorities. Dan, Ishan, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Kathleen. And I think, these, the commitments process is not one in which we are asking you to wish things into existence. So I think lots of the highest impact commitments are somewhat contingent. But I still think there are ways to include supplemental actions that may be outside of the legislative domain in this commitment. For example, what are the other ways and the other tools at the governor's disposal that would indicate that they really mean business, that their support for this is meaningful and substantive? And so maybe it's that there's a task force exploring all of the ways to support this cluster statewide, and you know that that's going to be really important for your application and for the work you're trying to do in your region. Maybe it's assembling a council of CEOs that are leading and providing insights on the work that will need to be done in order for this to succeed. It could be a whole range of things, but I would encourage you to help the governor think about the governor's team to think about other ways to advance this commitment with the things that are at their disposal today, in addition to the work that they're reaching for to help you in a world of legislative change.
And I would just quickly add that, there's a lot of folks with expertise in your coalitions that are very familiar with the local political dynamics. And so this is a great opportunity to engage them in their suggestions on how you might get, for example, as Dan was saying, the governor or the executive branch at state agencies to operate and commit to other actions that aren't dependent on legislative outcomes.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ishan. I was going to actually add, thinking about what are the departments that are out there that can be leveraged, and can the governor make a commitment that, the Economic Development Authority or your Department of Administration or something like that is going to make is going to move forward with some piece of things as well. All right, well, we've talked a lot about governance, and it keeps coming up. So here's one that I think might be a half commitment, half governance question. Which entity will be responsible for ensuring that these commitments come to fruition? And will these commitments be part of the reporting metrics? I'm specifically thinking of scenarios where a project has a different lead institution and co-applicant.
Yeah, I think that most definitely is built into the commitments. I think in other sessions we touched upon the need to have tracking and monitoring of the commitments and timelines along the way. And so I think to some extent that might differ, if there's a particular person, if it's within each of the projects, but that it is, bubbling up into that larger, tracking and mechanism. I'll leave the compliance with respect to, the grant itself to your regional economic development person. That's really a question that's is much better answered by that individual.
Yeah, I think we don't have, sorry, Kathleen, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I think we don't have line of sight into the ultimate reporting process. I would hope that this would be a component of it. But I think to Kathleen's point, like it is on the applicant coalition, I think, to structure this, to hold itself and outside commitment makers accountable. So anticipating, planning, and following up and celebrating commitments, not only when they're made, publicly celebrating them, not only when they're made, but also when they're made good upon, I think is a really important component of doing this well. So it's incumbent on you to continue to exert the leverage, I think, that you have as coalitions in driving this forward.
Great, thank you. And I will say, as a lead applicant on a federal grant with a coalition of partners, it's usually the lead applicant that is responsible for that, whether or not it's your actual body of work. So that is something to think about, is, what would be your approach or tactic for making sure that all of those partners are able to follow through. Okay, so we're a state that has a few sizable foundations. Average grants are usually in the range of $10,000. How might that affect the perception of our match and the level of regional commitment? And how might we tackle this? I have a good answer for foundations, if I can say.
Go for it, Jen.
A lot of foundations are starting to do impact investing with their endowed funds. So it's not just the money that they're giving away, but also are there ways that they can make actual investments, maybe an equity investment in your cluster or something like that with a percentage of their endowed funds, so that they can go beyond the level of grant making that they're doing. And if anyone is interested in knowing more about that, that's kind of a pet project of mine. So I'm happy to help and talk more to any of the specific regions that might be interested in that. Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll just offer up. I mean, I think the just circumstances vary widely here, as in all elements of an application from across this applicant pool. So I think that this deserves to be taken into account. Some metro areas and some regions have way more philanthropic resources locally focused than others. And so I think I think that the goal is to get these potential partners to sign aboard, to sign up, lock arms with you and invest what they can. And in some cases, that means steering their resources to be more aligned with the work that you're proposing, because you have shared goals, but there's an opportunity to get more specific in how it would really support, for example, workforce pipelines. And I think recognizing that meeting them where they are is going to be critical is I think is part and parcel of this. So I think it's like, if you have concerns about the size of the commitment that a philanthropic organization is making, I think you should include a baseline of what their overall giving budget is annually and what a percentage is. So I think there's ways in which to make this more transparent and visible for those that are reviewing commitments.
And to Dan's point, we've talked again about governance, evaluation, data tools. Sometimes the local philanthropies have that capacity as well, and they can partner with you on that chunk of work. I mean, that's certainly something that I've experienced working with both national foundations and with smaller community foundations. So there's ways to, how do you partner with them? And yes, meet them where they are, leverage that asset. Can those foundations come together as a critical mass, right? Because then it's not additive, it's exponential in terms of the impact that might be bringing. And I recognize, and I just want to say again out loud, March 15th is pretty close. So we understand that there are incredible time constraints, there are relationship constraints. So it's not as if we're urging you to chase after commitments that you may don't have a foot in the door already. Focus where you do and build on those and strengthen those. And then of course there's a roadmap beyond that about how to access and strong other kinds of commitments across other partnerships. And we'll be talking, in the next few weeks also about particularly philanthropic commitments. But again, today it's really about the commitments that you have and how to strengthen them, recognizing whatever those sort of limitations and the strengths are of the institutions in your region.
Yeah, great point, Kathleen. And I think also remembering that they, like other anchor institutions in your region, are also doing their own procurement processes. They're also employers. So are there other ways that they can be making specific commitments to hire from the pipeline that you're creating? Can they be bringing in, purchasing their resources from the cluster that you're trying to develop, et cetera? All right, we have, I think, probably our last question, but it's a very important one. Could you please address the need for leverage from an equity lens, noting that very often the hefty relationships and the commitments needed are more accessible to the good old boys network, white, wealthy, male, et cetera? It's been asked by a few folks, but they're feeling like they need a little bit more depth of answer. It's, I think, a very complex question that everybody across the country is certainly grappling with in quite a public way.
Yeah, and equity, again, is the #1 investment criteria for the EDA. And to go to, to your partners, your industry partners, your foundational partners, with that lens and not hat in hand, right? You're coming from this position of power as a finalist within this region. I think to Don's point, this to some extent goes to how your coalition is comprised to the best, to the best that you can. Who are those within your coalition that actually represent that voice of the communities that have been left out, who are frankly probably best situated to explain the lived experience, the distress suffered, and the impact that these dollars can have. And in some sense, for a lot of these partners, do they want to be part of the solution of the future? I mean, it's asking them, in a bold public way, to be part of something that is, again, transformative, that they'll want to take credit for and be part of, and will benefit them as well.
I think those are absolutely great points, Kathleen. I think another way to think about this is the memo and the guidance that we provide can also serve as forcing functions for getting in those rooms and having those conversations with folks that may not be a part of your network in the first place, or for reaching the folks within your coalition and communicating the sort of level at which we are thinking about competitive commitments. And so, using our resources to sort of propel you forward in terms of those engagements, I think is another way to help, tap those networks or secure the level of commitments that we are talking about today.
I think the commitments process is not a tool to upend some of the inequitable distribution of resources within a region, right? And so I think the question is a little bit about that too. So this is, I think it's important to recognize that, and that one tool in which to think about it, as I think both Kathleen and Ishan have alluded to, is that I think you have a filter and expertise within your coalition, within your applicant coalition, about what a meaningful win looks like and what equity, how equity should be advanced through this work. And I think what that means is if you're talking to like an industry partner and their idea is like, hey, we'd just love to donate 50 laptops because we think that's going to be a useful addition. That's not actually, that kind of in-kind donation is not going to move the needle in a meaningful way for a community to meaningfully participate in the economic vision you have for the future. And I think it's incumbent on us and it's incumbent on you all to challenge them to do better.
Yeah, great point, Dan. And I think also, Dan, you had brought this up before when we were talking about the foundation letters, but you may not have the same dollar amount or staffing amount of commitment, but if it's a personally meaningful or organizationally meaningful commitment from a smaller organization that is putting a substantial share of their resources, even if they have less resource behind it, that's a strong commitment. So they may not have the same dollar amount as R1 university might have, but they're in and they're part of that coalition with you and they're standing with you. So I think don't discount the smaller commitments that are coming from that, important sectors of your community that have been historically excluded from building up some of those resources. And we have a final tangible question. Where do we find the link to the intake form that was mentioned in the slide?
So great question. I believe I can't see the chat exactly, so someone might have shared it in the chat. If not, I would check your inboxes from an email from Scott to receive the broader memo, which is a PDF. And in that memo, there will be a link to intake form, and as well as it will be shared through the resource library in the final package sent by the TA Coalition at the end of, I believe, tomorrow.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I don't know if you want to do any closing remarks. Take thumbs up or thumbs down. Yeah, Dan wants to. Great.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, first of all, thanks to this team. I mean, it's been amazing to draw on the insights of Kathleen and to work closely with Ishan on this. I think this is a really important and meaningful opportunity for not only enhancing your specific application, but for bringing more organizations to the table to contribute and shore up key elements of what you're hoping to achieve with an ambitious vision. it is all, I think, tied up in the specifics of what these organizations are signing on to. And so everything we just gave you is an overview of how to think about it from our perspective, from what we've seen that works, how to approach it, the key categories of actors and the kinds of commitments you might expect to get from them. But all of this is an exercise in driving your partners, using your leverage to be ambitious, specific, measurable, novel, and high impact. And I think we would look forward to being able to work with you on brainstorming how to do that in your domain and in your region. Those are my parting thoughts. Kathleen, anything else from you or Ishan?
I think it's a great point about even putting together where these partners fit into the strategy, right? Helps you also to put a sharper focus on what needs to get done and by whom. You all have taken on really bold, ambitious projects, which is amazing. And you are building out a cluster and an ecosystem of these players. So the opportunity really is to, how are they in with you, right? In with you together, locked arms, I think as someone on this call or someone else said. And, beyond the examples, is it chambers of commerce, right? Is it other, other councils and groups of entities that are reflective of the way that your community has operated. So I would just urge you to be creative and yet specific. So I know it's a challenge in that way, but I know this group is up to it. So and as Dan said, we are here. We're hearing what you're saying to us, and we're looking to keep to provide you with the content and support as you move forward on this.
Yeah, and just to finish up, I know we have a few minutes left, or you all have a few minutes left in the session. I'm already seeing a few responses to the Google form. So if you might spend the time now filling that out, that would be wonderful, because then I think we can maximize the amount of support that we can give you. But thank you so much for listening. This has been such a pleasure.
Great. Well, thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. I hope we answered them all for you. And I would underscore, I think I don't want to make sure it didn't get lost. Somebody said, write your own commitments. I would absolutely underscore that when you're asking for a letter of support, don't expect that institution to know what it is that you need in your application. Draft them and give it to them. And the worst that they say is no. So ask for a bold commitment and let them bargain you down if they need to do that. And I think our next session will start at 3:15. So we got a few minutes for you to fill out that intake form and get another cup of coffee, and we'll see you back here in a few minutes.